Hi, and welcome to this CCSE conversation. This is a follow-on from last week and our initiative by the Centre for Culture, Sport and Events of the University of the West of Scotland. We've developed from a collaborative partnership with UWS and Renfrewshire Council for the centre, and we've been running these conversations each week for the past couple of months and will continue to do so through to the end of the year during COVID. The Centre for Culture, Sport and Events provides a space to undertake collaborative research and development work that has local, national and international relevance. And each week we've had a different topic in which we're focusing on and how our lives have been affected by COVID. Today I'm going to introduce you to Geert George, who is the director of UNIC and became the director in 2018. Geert was previously the founding director of the Goethe Institute's branch in the Democratic Republic of Congo. She's held different roles for the Goethe Institute in Seoul, Tokyo, Johannesburg and Munich main office, and where she was deputy head of communications. And she formerly worked as a cultural manager and a writer with a focus on visual arts and literature. She's got a wealth of experience, and today I've asked Geert to join us to talk a little bit about her role as a director of UNIC Global and how she normally engages with cultural institutes, and then we're going to look at a bit about what's changed and have a conversation around that. So welcome and thank you for joining us and being part of this conversation series, and I'm really looking forward to having her chat. Thanks.
Thanks for having me. Really excited to be here.
That's great. So maybe you could start by just saying a little bit about what your role normally entails for UNIC and explain to our viewers what UNIC normally does and what that stands for, because for some people they may have had some engagement with yourselves, but they won't perhaps be sure of the wider role that you have.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll start by talking a little bit about our network. So UNIC is the EU National Institutes for Culture. It's a network of those organizations of EU member states, including the UK still, that engage with cultural relations between the art scene, art community, and the wider communities, and with partner countries all over the world. So we have 36 members. Each European country sort of defines this cultural relations a bit different and has a different way of explaining or implementing cultural relations with other countries. And so some have a quite independent organization with large networks on a global scale. Some are actually also ministries of foreign affairs. Some have an agency, sort of independent agency that's responsible for dealing with this with international culture in a way, sort of facilitating that there's exchange going on the arts and culture between the artistic community of that country and the rest of the world. And so these organizations from the EU have gotten together in 2006, so it's a relatively young network, to say we need to collaborate better together as Europeans, as European organizations, and we also want to become a partner of the EU when the EU deals with culture. And so these are a bit the two main axes of our work. One is trying to work together as Europeans, and because our work is quite similar, and it's really rooted in this sort of bilateral approach. You know, France with a country like Kenya, then also Germany and a country like Kenya, and then at the same time we're also working with the EU to see how the EU can define its own approach to cultural relations, and then we're also there to support the implementation of it. Mm-hmm. So much to the network. So we do have a global scope. Actually, we counted recently. We did a survey thanks to COVID, and we have our members altogether have 2,500 branches worldwide.
Oh, wow.
And so some have really big networks.
Yeah, and that's the sort of scale of it that I was talking about. People wouldn't realize that. Yeah.
And then when at least 3 of these branches of our members are in one place, they can formalize this partnership within this framework of our network, UNIC, and this has happened so far in 120 places. So it's relatively large in scope.
And a cluster.
This is called a cluster, yeah. So it's a relatively informal way of collaboration. It's like a collaboration platform for European cultural relations. And so in the Brussels office, we interact with these clusters. We support our members in adding that European dimension to their work. We also have a cluster fund, for instance, so we have a small grant scheme available for these clusters to motivate them to engage in a European scale. And at the same time, we also work with our members' headquarters, which are mostly based in the capitals of the EU countries. And we organize, for example, general assemblies where our members decide on the broader vision, on the next steps. And we have one planned for next week. So that's a bit of how I, in my role, also engage with our network.
Mm-hmm. And so obviously that has changed because many of the work that you would do or the meetings that you would have, and you said you would travel a lot, and because of COVID, we're seeing ourselves traveling less, and a lot of that's closed. And I think, some of the things that certainly we've talked about before is that cultural relations allow you to build that people-to-people networks and that trust and the working together and understanding what each other does in the wider world. How do you think that's been affected and how by COVID, and what are you doing to try to facilitate your work still continuing, and how that's affected your network?
On the operational level, yes, you're right. I think our work, cultural relations work, heavily relies on people meeting, on bringing people together around the wider field of the arts and culture and education and adjacent fields. And of course, not only with traveling coming to a halt, but also with these restrictions that we have concerning meetings, has had a big effect. So if you can't bring a group of people together in one room in workshops, for instance, or for a concert, or for a gallery, for the exhibition opening, then that has huge impact. I mean, basically that goes to the core of our work. So this combination of the social distancing or physical distancing and mobility, because of course we rely on art sectors in the countries that we operate in, but also our own, to be healthy. And I mean, that's something that's been shattered. A lot of artists already have lived in precarious situations, and that's now that's exacerbated through the crisis. But then we also operate on this level of transnational exchange, sort of bringing people together across borders. And that is also, of course, not really possible anymore, as there are travel bans, travel restrictions, and people are generally also afraid to fly or to travel because they care about their health, which is absolutely normal and understandable. And so, and also language courses is something that our members do as well. How can education continue? You probably see this also at the university with distancing measures in place. And so what we've seen on that level is, of course, the digital coming into effect, and a lot of our activities have moved online. I think in spring and summer, there's been a bit of a dip. At the same time, also a lot of experiments in trying out new formats of engaging with our communities through social media and through other platforms. And now we see that, I think first colleagues were waiting, well, maybe after the summer in the Northern Hemisphere, after this break, we can then continue our work as usual, and that also has turned out to be false. So now we see a lot of hybrid models, conferences turning completely online, half online, and I think for the longer run we'll see how maybe new formats of engaging in the artistic, but also in the people-to-people approach will come about.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think there's probably quite a big dip initially, with especially for some of the cultural institutes or agencies, things like the British Council and Confucius and these type of organisations, who education would be a main part of their income as well, but also of their message that they are transmitting around the world. And with that dropping, then they're having to think of things differently, as you say. So it's about trying to rebuild that and try to look for projects as well within that still maintains the relations. I was reading some stuff that was on the cultural diplomatic side, saying that there was more of a need for cultural diplomacy now than ever, because as borders are closing because of COVID, and we have to avoid the possibility of blaming other nations for virus transmission or for works not happening and things like that. And actually the culture and cultural relations then could be at the heart of some of these solutions as well. Have you experienced some of that, and what your networks are trying to do to bring that back on track?
Yes, one of the interesting effects that the pandemic has had was that our members sort of moved closer together, and they published a statement actually reminding our leaders of the positive impact that culture and cultural relations can have on our relationship with the world today. Because I think this is what we have seen in the reactions to the crisis, was that and I think this is also quite normal. You first sort of take care of yourself, and then you see what's happening around you. So we've seen a little bit of a tendency to, to occupy yourself with the national again. Governments have put out support schemes for artists in their country and artists and creative industries and so on. And so we see the role of our network in also reminding our leaders and the world and society at large that we mustn't forget about exchange across borders. We must not stop exchanging. And I think this is something we'd have to look into with. I think mobility has been under stress already because of the environmental challenges that we're seeing. And so I hope that one of the positive outcomes of the crisis is that we reflect on which travels are actually necessary. And I don't only talk about people traveling, but when we have exhibitions that tour the world or theater plays that tour the world, there's also shipments going on and exhibitions being shipped somewhere and then completely destroyed. So in any case, there's a lot of room to also question our practice and take into account the challenges of our world today. But yeah, we heavily believe in the positive impact that cultural relations and creating this trust and understanding through allowing people to meet, getting to know each other, thereby overcoming stereotypes or preconceptions. And we really urge organizations and governments to not stop funding this kind of work. Because we've seen the local art scenes being supported, and I'm really glad to see also that the European Parliament is reminding everyone also that transnational exchange must not stop, and so we need support schemes that this can continue as well. And maybe one other aspect that we mustn't forget in our field, when we deal with cultural organizations in other countries, I think as EU or as European countries, we're pretty privileged in that there is money available and that most governments see the role of arts and culture for society. And so there are these support schemes in Germany, in France, and in other countries. But when you talk about, Nigeria, Kenya, Colombia, and these are countries where budgets are not as big as they might be in Germany, for instance. And so arts organizations that would usually be our partners are under a lot of stress. And so we also have a duty or mission or a responsibility to support those. And we see that some of our members have taken that into account into the programs that they put out now in the crisis, and our own grant scheme that I mentioned before, the Cluster Fund, also put that at the center to say, how can we develop projects, collaboration projects that also support the local cultural sectors that we usually interact with. So coming back to the sense of global responsibility or global solidarity. Yeah. And maybe one other thing that you mentioned, actually, revenue. I think that's also an important point. Yeah, some of our members rely on income. And in this survey that we did in May, we also asked, what do you think are the repercussions for you as an institution? And of course, there's a lot of fear, not only about this loss of income, and I think that has probably been maintained because now we see that everything is moving online, and I think people want to continue to learn languages, even though they cannot go to a school or to an institute where they can do it, but it does happen online. But I think there's fear of budget cuts for next year and then the year after, because this is also something we see, is that still culture is seen as some sort of luxury and not a necessity. And so we're trying to work together, not just within our membership, but also with other cultural organizations to say, no, there's a human right to culture. And it's a necessity and not a luxury. So lots of different challenges.
Oh, that's a great one to pick up on, of course, because that you're absolutely right. There is a UN human right to access to culture and leisure and recreation, but often forgotten sometimes by people in policy positions. And so I wanted to ask you about how you're, it's fine when you're linking in country and you're looking at these agencies and you're saying people are now making funds available or recognising the importance of cultural relations locally. How is that? How are you connecting to the policymakers, for example, in the European Parliament that might be making policy at that level? And how does your organisation link with that policy to then be a strategy for you going forward and reacting to this crisis?
Well, we're in touch with sort of colleagues in the European Commission, or in the EU institutions. This comes from our partnership agreement that we have with the EU to jointly go forward in the field of cultural relations. As you know, the EU doesn't have the competence for culture. That remains in the member states, but the EU can coordinate and complement. And so this is how we sort of get together with them. And so there's a constant exchange going on. Speaking about the larger strategy, when the strategy of the EU on international cultural relations was made in 2016, there was a preparatory action that went before that, where some of our members also were members of the consortium, and so pushed that forward. And so there is a bit of an exchange going on how this strategy is defined and the values that are now in it. For example, global solidarity, principles of mutual listening and learning, rather than sort of top-down approach that was traditional for the EU, I think, for Europe. And so that's I think why, and we've now that this strategy has been published in 2016, incorporated those values again in our own strategic framework. So there's a strong link between the two. And when it comes to the European Parliament, the members of Parliament are our representatives as citizens of the EU, and so you can contact them and talk to them. And this is maybe one of the things that we see, that now in this crisis, or in the way that the EU defines foreign policy, it's very much about security. It's of course also about finding solutions for the pandemic. And then we say, yeah, but don't forget about culture. And I think there's growing determination also in the Parliament that not only culture is important, but also cultural relations. And so we talk to members of Parliament about this.
Yeah, I think we're witnessing here in many local projects and national projects that culture is being used as a way of connecting people that are in isolation, that are lonely, and the things that we were seeing before of some people feeling that that was out of their reach or it wasn't quite for them is now something that's bringing communities together that were perhaps isolated or not together in the past or in some way fractured. And so it's, for an academic like me, it's interesting to see that role of culture playing and coming into its own there on a local level. And as you say, it's really nice in a way to look and see that the EU strategy from 2016, if I'm right, I think they've just called for a refresh of that as well, based on these values that you're saying on humanity and human rights and solidarity, but from a grassroots perspective as well. So I think if we come out of this in some way, do you think that we will have learned lessons, not just about the hybrid nature of delivery and things, because everyone's saying that about what they'll do in terms of digital, and I understand that that's not always possible for everybody because there's a poverty divide in that alone, for example. But do you think that we'll see more recognition of culture as a human right and that it isn't a luxury? I'm starting to see questions coming through. There's loads of questions coming through that we'll get to in a few minutes, but certainly some of that is coming through there.
I do find. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I agree. We shouldn't only take lessons from now we've learned how to make an online conference. I mean, this is about instruments and tools. And it's important as well. And I think we've made leaps forward. But I would hope that the learnings also reflect more social questions, as you mentioned. And interestingly enough, we did a survey with our members in May and June, and we asked them a couple of questions on what the impacts of this crisis were. And one question also talked about new programs and projects and who they were made for. And we specifically asked, actually, did you make new programs for senior citizens or for children or for health workers? Because those were social groups that were becoming more visible or visible in a different way in the reportage about the pandemic, and groups that definitely were seen differently. And at the time, of course, this was just weeks after COVID first hit, there was none that had already looked at how to reach out to these groups. But we'll do the survey again, or we'll do an update next year to see what are the longer term consequences. And I hope that I see a bit more in that level, because I think and I really hope, I mean, we're also, last year in December, we started a project on fair collaboration in international cultural relations. Our General Assembly gave us the task to actually make some sort of toolkit to see how can we engage fairly in our work with our partners worldwide. And I think this fair collaboration, it also extends to sort of asking ourselves, who do we reach actually? Who do we talk to when we're in India or when we're in Nigeria? Do we reach the educated groups, or do we reach other groups? And I think the same goes for here in Belgium and within the EU. I mean, for us, this divide inside outside doesn't really exist. I think it goes hand in hand, and I think this is also a development of our days, that it's hard to separate what's inside, outside, what's foreign, and what's internal. But in our own countries, we see different groups and different pockets of society. And do we, as cultural organizations, reach out to them, or do we stay with what we're used to? And I think sort of health workers or senior citizens, I think, have not been one of the traditional target groups of our work. But yeah, as you said, those might be experiencing heightened levels of isolation, and can we, through the media that we have, reach out to those? And also, how can we use our knowledge of, for example, of working in Ethiopia, where already you have you know that very few people have access to the internet. So you would ask yourself already, how do you reach out through other media like radio to those that do not have access to internet? But in our own societies, we have the same problem, and hopefully we can actually put that into practice. What we always talk about, learning also from experiences in what used to be considered, or what is the global South, or yeah.
Definitely, I think this is one of the things that we were trying to counter anyway, which was some of the digital poverty and digital divide, and in a way, COVID is exacerbating that. There's been some funding, of course, made available through educational establishments for schools and universities, and that's okay with equipment, but it doesn't get you bandwidth, it doesn't get you data, it doesn't get you access in that sense. And so these are going to be the continued challenges for us to try to overcome.
I think, sorry to interrupt, I think that is so interesting because these questions, we've had I used to work in the DRC in Congo, and these are questions that I know that I've had with with colleagues and with partners there for years and years. And it was part of our normal sort of, our system. How can we reach out to colleagues, and how can we overcome these huge gaps in digital infrastructure? Because it's also not just bandwidth, it's also how much does 1 megabyte cost? Mm-hmm. And now we have these same discussions here. So I think there's an interesting learning process that we could.
Do you have any solutions for that, Geet?
Well, solutions. I think there are already projects out there that and experts that think about sort of digital or ethical approaches to the digital. Barcelona, for example, as a city, has a huge initiative of open source and creating software and data that is seen as an infrastructure, public infrastructure that belongs to all. We actually are planning our own digital week in November, where we'll look at AI and what it means for cultural relations. And there's another project of one of our a unique project in the US called The Grid, looking at how to bring tech and arts together. And it's actually the colleagues that are in charge of the project are based in San Francisco, Silicon Valley. And there, I think we're looking at the ethical dimension of all of this. And so I think we need to bring these different voices together and create learning platforms. And we'll do a small start with our own digital week, but maybe just more knowledge about this and more exchange. I know it's so easy to say, but
No, I think the AI stuff has been looked at much more quickly now than it perhaps would have been for engagement in a whole range of purposes. But none of that gets away from the thing that we would say really helps diplomatic relations and cultural relations, and that's that people-to-people contact and project-based. And also, I think because in-country projects with local experts and actors on the ground are always more important than those that would be parachuted in, as we've talked about before. That I hate that sort of Western approach of we parachute in an expert, but in actual fact, the whole point with cultural relations and what's really good about what you do is that it's not that. It's working with the partners on the ground and the networks, and so they're authentic and they're real, and the work with the grassroots and the policymakers then are joined up. And I think that's why I like what the work of UNIC does, because it is joined up. It's not artificial. Anyway, I think if you want to say a sort of last word, I'm going to put you on to questions, because I've got a whole stream of questions coming in on our social media platforms. But I wanted to say thank you very much for joining me for this conversation today.
Thanks. It was a real pleasure.
Thank
and lots of interesting subjects we touched upon. I guess we could continue this conversation.
For sure. I think that's certainly a lot more than just a half hour, but I'm going to ask you some questions because I'm being fed the questions because we've been live streaming on various platforms, as I've said to you. So we'll see how the questions go. But firstly, I think we should definitely highlight, it says that Geet is a great speaker, as someone has said. So they said, Have UNIC had conversations with other organisations whose activities will have been disrupted by the situation, where they perhaps have similar working practices to UNIC, such as GIZ?
Yeah, GIZ. I think that's if that's the same GIZ, the German Agency for Development Cooperation. We are in touch with other networks, with other organizations. I wouldn't say that we have structured approaches to that, but we're also one of the networks that's supported by the Creative Europe program of the EU, and particularly the network strand. So as a European network, we're supported, which is great. And there's altogether 28 networks. So IETM, it's a performance arts network, for instance, is in that. Europa Nostra, which is cultural heritage. And with these, actually, we've seen that the exchange has been improved through this crisis. We all know each other. We meet once or twice a year, but there's this mutual learning. How do you best organize online? We have to do elections for our board, for instance, online now. So there's this very operational learning, and in terms of work sort of on the ground, or actual activities, yes, I think our colleagues are in touch with organizations. Usually they are really well connected. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Okay, and I'm probably going to, because there's so many, I'll try and put a few together here and just let you hear them, and then you can answer. So, and thank you for sending these questions in. It says, what do you think the most positive and negative aspect that has come out of COVID, from COVID with cultural relations? Do you think cultural relations will continue to utilise digital platforms? Do you think the lack of social events and travelling abroad will affect the long term in society? And I'll start with these four. And with such uncertainty, how do you even begin to plan for 2021 and beyond? And do you see areas of culture being affected worse than others, perhaps even geographical differences?
I think that's a great question. How do you even start planning for 2021? We have our General Assembly next week, and we do have to present our activity plan. And we sort of said, this is what we would have planned, and we'll just put it on there, and then we'll have to take it as we go. Trying to do things hybridly or online, I think this is something that has to be explored. The best and the worst thing, I think, what we've all seen, like what we've experienced, I think, is how social we are as human beings, and how also arts and culture figure in that. I notice more and more that, of course, I can also listen to a panel discussion, or I can actually attend conferences online, and I do it. But it's just not the same as going, because I don't only go for the content. I also go because you're in a space where everyone is concentrating on the same thing, watching a performance or watching a debate. And you can sort of feel what the reactions in the room are. And so you're brought together with other people. And then, even though you might not actually meet anyone new, but you still have this feeling of interacting, whereas at home, it's just a very different thing. And we've turned to watching film series, we've reading books, listening to music. All of that is arts and culture. All of that is what we do, and what we sort of also promote in the international dimension, sort of in this exchange process. And I think we've realized that. And now what needs to follow is this realization of our leaders that this also then deserves adequate support, and the realizations, not just how many jobs that creates, and how important TV and film markets are, but also what that does for people, and how we need that to survive and have a worthwhile life. Mm-hmm. The worst thing from COVID, what's the worst thing? Of course, that people are sick and dying. And in terms of my immediate work, I do think sort of this cut in mobility and this cut in actually meeting people and exchanging, I think for a limited of time, we can handle it. It's just a question of how long will this prevail. And the longer it goes on, the more disruptive it will really be. So that would be my fear.
Yeah.
this is what I retain from your questions. I think I've
No, I think you covered them very well. So I've got another couple. One says here, it's probably a follow-on to a bit of that, where I'm talking about the working environment for artists and actors. And, I'm thinking as well for everybody behind the scenes, that are, the event organizers of the stage and everything else and the supply chains that go with that. But also there's been a bit of debate in because of an online advert in Britain here. And so someone has put this as a question, saying, how do we reconcile the issue mentioned where culture and the arts as a profession, but income streams have been disrupted? And now we're seeing pressures in the UK telling artists to reskill or retrain. And I think it's been claimed it was an unfortunate advert that went out with a ballet dancer saying she will retrain in tech and she just doesn't know it yet. So, and that's had obviously, as you might imagine, a massive backlash about why should the arts retrain in something that you have dedicated your life to doing, and the culture isn't a luxury. And so I think the question then is, how do we reconcile these, as art and culture is also a profession? And have you seen anything like that elsewhere?
I think this is what this crisis is showing, that is how precarious the arts and cultural sectors are organized, and what working conditions are really like. There's been maybe a bit of a similar case in one of the from one member state. One of the representatives of the arts sector has said, well, if you can't deal with insecurities, then maybe the arts sector isn't for you. And I think it was meant it wasn't meant as it sounds. It was just sort of acknowledging that if you go from engagement to engagement, it's not the same as having the secure job in a government agency, for instance. And I think it is also fair to say that this is something that young artists might need to realize. The same thing, I don't think that this should be used to sort of turn people away who have a calling and who have a skill in the arts and in culture. But I think it would be great, and I know that also parliamentarians are working on that, to create more stability also in this sector. But I also think that we have to, and this is something I really hope that we can use this time for, is how can we set up our own practice to be fairer? This comes back to what I mentioned about fair collaboration. I don't know if people realize how self-abusive the arts and cultural sectors can be. There are museums, there's organizers who don't pay honorariums or fees to artists because they say, we give you a platform so you have visibility, and that should be enough. And big museums do this. I mean, this is pretty standard practice. Our members sometimes do this for diplomatic do it when they have a party and they want a band to play. Oh, can't you do it for free? Because you get all these important people who get to hear you. And I think we shouldn't do this, because we also don't go to a caterer and say, well, I mean, you have a lot of famous people here that will get to taste your food. Why don't you do it for free? And it's out of question that can be offered for free. But it happens in the arts and cultural sector. So, I hope we find ways of working, of creating work environments that stabilize this entire sector. And I think this is also the danger, that the longer this crisis prevails, the more it will, it will have negative effects. And I was surprised to see how, I also know that when hiring someone, the kinds of contracts you can make with your own staff, there are a lot of laws around it to create a sense of security for the employee. And then when I look at the cultural sector and what's going on with how actors, how they go from project to project and sometimes are hired just for 2 days or so, I cannot understand how that can be reconciled with the way that I've learned the labor market is organized. And so apparently there are a lot of exceptions for the cultural sector, and I hope this can be amended a bit. And it's also, I mean, now all of these support schemes that have been set up, a lot of artists, a lot of these solo entrepreneurs fall through the net because their situation is so singular and different that none of these big schemes really help them. And so I hope we take the right lessons. I mean, I hope our leaders take the right lessons from it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've like that witnessed and know artists and musicians, whatever, who is precarious enough at the best of times, as you say, they go from job to job. And then this situation has meant that's been, exceptionally difficult for them. And almost they've created their own charitable organisations to draw in funds to perform distance or whatever. Anyway, I think we've got time for one last question, and I've got a question here, which is really good, from one of our students that says, what do you suggest for a university student who's interested in working in the cultural sector at European level? And have you any tips on that for them?
Well, I think internships in a way are a great way to get to know a sector and get some experience. At the same time, of course, you don't want to, we shouldn't exploit interns as well. So I see the danger of this entire system. But there are paid internships, for instance, also at EU level. I think coming to Brussels and working in an organization or in one of these networks that I've mentioned that are supported by Creative Europe is a good way to get a feeling both for culture and then also this policy scheme that you see here in Brussels and how all of that interacts. Or go work for an MP, for instance, one that's in the cultural committee, and see the work of culture from that side. I think that can also be interesting. And don't be afraid to come to Brussels. I know it can seem, when I think of myself as at the age of 20 or 21, I always thought, well, EU is far away and you need to know 5 languages in order to even stand a chance. But it's good to know languages, but everyone is a learner. So also we are learners, and we're not perfect or fluent in so many languages.
I think that's absolutely great. I think we could finish on that as a very nice positive on which to finish. I think you're doing a great job in Munich, and thank you very much for your contribution on Twitter and others areas. It's been lots of questions have come in. I think we've covered most of them, and it's certainly given food for thought, and people seem to have really liked the conversation today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for those really interesting questions.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. That's finished. Thanks.